remember that many people taking drugs. You don't think there's any kind of plan or anything?
Say, man, I don't know. But sometimes I am prone to believe in this genocide thing that I hear some of the more militant black groups talk about, you know, because it seems like young black kids, not only in New York, in other large urban communities across the length and breadth of this country, are just going hog wild over drugs. Now, I can't say that these drugs are being planted in the black communities, you know, to destroy black youth. I can't say this, but I do know that I feel that there's some connection. I certainly do, especially with the rise of this, what am I trying to think of, Planned Parenthood thing, where you find all your Planned Parenthood centers in the black ghetto. But if there was a plan, let's just concede or assume there was a plan by some unscrupulous whites in this country to commit genocide against blacks. The plan certainly backfired, excuse the pun, because as many young whites are availing themselves of drugs and are certainly availing themselves of the facilities of the Planned Parenthood organizations as are blacks. So,
have you been involved with any people that who foresee or see any kind of thing like this possibly happening as far as?
I'm not involved personally with any, no.
Right.
But I read consistently, and some militants are saying, are trying to prove that there is a connection, and they make a damn good case of, you know, it. I'm just not involved to the extent of actually knowing about it, and I don't want to indict,
right,
you know, right, without being damn sure before I make this blanket indictment.
Right. You know. What about $1 million worth of dope that you shot in 20 years, man? And that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of bread, baby.
How you must have spent some real trying situations sometime and some real close escapes and connected with some all kinds of things.
Man.
Tell me something that really sticks out in your mind as far as when you really wanted to fix and got hung up and couldn't get the bread or something like that. Can you remember anything that really sticks out in your mind?
Well, man, I remember one time, my very first attempt. I went on after this to be more successful in stealing, but my very first attempt, man, at stealing resulted in a fiasco. I went downtown to Boost to steal something to get my fix money, and the item that I decided to steal was women's underskirts. Underclothes, slips, you know, I don't know what the hell you call it.
Yeah, okay.
Underslips, right, undergarments,
well,
women's lingerie.
They don't wear many of them anymore.
Right, right, it's passé now. But, you know, I suppose this is far more humorous than it is on a serious note. But when I came out of the store, under my clothes, slips were hanging like a bridal train, and everybody in the store was aware that I had stolen the slips while I thought that I was going out of the store with them perfectly concealed on my person. And naturally, before I got to the door, the store detectives were rushing toward me, and I broke out the streets and started running down the street, and clothes were I was just leaving a veritable train of slips behind me, and a motorcycle cop ran down the street the same direction I was going and cut in front of me and pulled into the curb, and that's how I was apprehended. I ran right into his arm. It's more funny, but hey, the horrible part of it was that I had to spend the next 3 days in jail and undergo the terrible rigors of withdrawal, and that was really the terrible part.
Were you shooting heavy then?
Not as heavy as I did in later years, but it was heavy enough for me to undergo some real serious withdrawal symptoms.
Let me ask you this. In terms of monies that you ever got, is when you were going through, basically you were trying to get that $150 a day. It wasn't much over that. Did you ever try to get anything over that, or were you just basically trying to fulfill?
No, basically trying to fulfill that need.
So you're just like an animal out there.
Just like that. Hey, listen, I've made as high as $150 a day and didn't have money to pay my rent.
What were you doing?
Shooting it up.
You shot up $150 a day and couldn't pay the rent.
And couldn't pay the rent. Hey, a lot of times I would get up the next morning to go to work and would have a great big fat $20 shot of dope and wouldn't have money to buy myself breakfast. But I'd have that narcotic. So man, I say that in terms of the standpoint of, just of health alone. How a guy can get hung up, get so strung out on stuff till he neglects the very things that keep a man alive, such as eating. Man.
What about the guys who are not so good at boosting?
Hey man, dudes do everything to get some dope. It ain't just the boosting. Cats steal there's all kinds of ways to make a buck illegally. Some of which I know and some of which of course I can't know. But kiting checks. In New York they call it downing digits, or they did. Stealing checks out of mailbox and cashing them. Guys mug people, hit them in the head and take money. Now, I haven't run into so much of this violent type of activity in the quest for bread to shoot, to get narcotics. But I know that it does happen. In the case of females, of course, it's a prostitution bed. And some of the hassles I imagine some of those girls have to go through in selling their bodies to get some drugs really makes it questionable in my mind as to whether it's really worth it or not.
What about the stealing bit and everything? A lot of people get a lot of fun out of that. But what do you know as far as stealing?
I guess essentially I'm not a thief because I don't dig stealing. I don't, to me it was a matter of having to get the drug, being faced with the necessity, the actual physical and mental necessity of having my medicine. Because after a while, narcotics become medicine. But it's a hassle, man.
Curley, let me ask you something. Is it easier to get drugs now than it was, say, 10 years ago?
I think it's a great deal easier. There are more drugs, and naturally since there are more drug users, there would be more drugs. So I think drugs are a lot more easy to acquire now than they were some years ago.
Now, you mentioned going into towns before. Sometimes it was pretty hard to get it. What do you see that's happening on the street today?
Well, it's really surprising. You can see, if you know what's happening, you can see drugs actually being sold on the streets. It's more open, and it's sold right on the street corners in Dopeville.
What's Dopeville?
Well, once again, usually the ghetto is where it's most open at. Now, of course, I don't like to go back to the suburb bit, but they're selling it there too, and on school campuses. But my area of activity has been, for the most part, in the ghetto, and that's where I see things mostly. So that's the place I'm talking about.
What about the price of it now? Has the price risen considerably? Is the price basically the same?
No, the price has risen considerably over the past decade, I'd say. About 1955, drugs were being sold for much cheaper. I'd say that the price has risen at least 5 times, whereas an individual shot a $5 bag now, or a $5 capsule now, would have sold for only $1 some years ago. So the price has risen approximately 5 times.
What about the contents? I hear things like the drugs now are not as strong. I'd say the heroin or whatever they were shooting in their arms.
Right.
Or the contents changed any?
Considerably. Drugs are a lot weaker now than they were some years ago. There are more people using them. There are more people selling them. So naturally, there's more drugs in being used. There's not more drugs in circulation. And unscrupulous dealers and pushers cut the drug with cutting agents. And consequently, the product is a heck of a lot weaker now than it was some years ago.
With you having a $150 a day habit at that time, and the price has changed now, what would you say the same habit would cost you per day now?
5 times as much as it did then.
So that means that the guy's really got to be out there doing all kinds of things in order to get his
Got to
drug.
do a lot of stealing. I think it's been estimated that in this town, through shoplifting activities, the merchants downtown lose approximately $2 million a year.
$2 million a year,
Right.
just in this town alone.
Just in this small town. Well, I would say small town, medium-sized town.
Curley, what real feeling did you get when you were shooting drugs?
Well, it's a high. It's a euphoric feeling, as I've said before. It's a feeling of well-being. You don't feel pain. If you have any physical ailments that result in pain, they're diminished considerably. I don't want to run the risk of popularizing drugs by saying they make you feel good, because this feeling doesn't last very long. And it certainly diminishes as time passes and drugs become more of a medicine. You take them for medicinal reasons after you really become seriously addicted, because without drugs your body doesn't function properly. You're in constant pain. So most addicts, after a number of years, take drugs just to get themselves back to normal rather than getting high. You seldom experience that high feeling that you used to get when you first started using drugs.
What kind of different drugs did you use?
Well, I guess I ran the gamut. Heroin principally, but I've used cocaine, Dilaudid, all the opiates, the opium derivatives, marijuana. I've dropped pills, barbiturates, and amphetamines. I haven't had too much experience with the hallucinogens, but I have had LSD one time, and I guess I had a bad trip, so I haven't fooled with that anymore.
What kind of trip did you have?
It was a scary thing, man. Like, my hands turned to blood, and I had no feet. Or so I thought. I was under the effects of LSD, and it was quite a scary thing. And the fellow that I was with, he had to hold me because I was in serious danger of doing something to myself, hurting myself in some way.
You mentioned cocaine. Now, how did you use that?
Well, I both sniffed it, snorted it, as they say, and I injected it in my veins as well. Cocaine has a very different high, and it lasts less longer than any of the other drugs, and you can really spend a lot of money fooling with cocaine. Cocaine in the vernacular is usually referred to as a rich man's dope, or narcotic.
What about the heroin?
Heroin is garbage. Heroin is the final distillation of opium. It's what they throw away medically. There is no known medical use for heroin. And it's, as I said, it's pure garbage. It's nothing. It's junk.
Do you use drugs now?
Occasionally, but very, very minimally. I don't have the addiction that I had at one time. It's an occasional thing now with me. won't claim that I've completely stopped using drugs, because that wouldn't be true. But when I feel very, very badly, very poorly, that is physically, I'll manage to get a small shot of drugs, and it diminishes any pain that I have in my body.
So right now you're in a state where you're trying to just quench the pain,
Right.
rather than trying to use it as far as getting high, anything like that.
I haven't been high in years.
Well, what would you estimate, say, your habit is now?
It's so negligible that I wouldn't even want to give a figure.
Curley, how did you manage to kick the habit, so to speak, or bring your drug use down to what it is now?
Well, first I tried to kick cold turkey. Now that term cold turkey means to withdraw from the use of drugs without any medical assistance, without any medication. I tried that unsuccessfully a number of times. And then I went into a drug abuse program. And through their detoxification program, their rehabilitation program, I managed to get away from the use of drugs to the extent that I am now.
I hear a lot of terminology that's being used now. I hear guys say dropping pills, and tell me some of the names and some of the things that they're currently seeing now, terminology that they're using as far as drugs are concerned.
Well, of course, there's a very extensive vocabulary that has sprung up around the drug culture. Far too numerous for us to mention here, but some of them are, well, heroin, for example, is known as horse or hulse, skag, stuff, jive, while cocaine is called snow, a girl, and then marijuana is known as grass, reefer, light green, smoke, pot, and then there's just tons of pills being used, but some of the more popular ones are Seconal and Turinol. And Seconal, they're called red devils in the vernacular, and Turinol is called Christmas trees. And then you have your diet pills, which a lot of youngsters are referring to as overs and unders, uppers and downers, etc.
How can a parent or a relative or a friend usually tell when somebody is under influence of some type of drug?
It's very difficult to tell when a kid is using drugs, but there are some telltale signs. Watch him closely, and if any of his habits, the consistent habits, change radically. For example, a child who is quiet and normally very taciturn, if that child should all of a sudden become very talkative, very verbose, that doesn't mean he's using drugs, or but this is one of the signs that the individual undergoes an almost radical change. He almost becomes the opposite of what he formerly or originally was. Then there are the physical symptoms: a runny nose. Of course, that could be a cold, couldn't it? Kids who lay around and sleep a lot, who don't seem to have any energy to do anything. They could be experimenting with dangerous drugs. I would say, parents, watch your children. Keep a very close eye on your kids. Go in their pockets occasionally. I know it might sound like, kind of sneaky, but go in their pockets and see what they've got on their person, because a lot of kids will carry stuff in their pockets.
What advice would you give to youngsters now? Through your experience, you shot $1 million worth of dope in your system. What advice would you give to young people right now about your experiences? What would you say?
I would tell all young people who are even mildly contemplating using drugs, or even if they've started using drugs, change your environment. Seek out new friends. There are a lot of youngsters who are not using drugs. Avoid those places where people congregate that use drugs. It's not chicken not to use drugs. it's smart not to use them. But in the main, I would say, there's an old saying about association bringing about assimilation, birds of a feather flocking together. Stay away from those youngsters and that environment wherein drugs are used, because it may rub off on you.
What would you tell a parent if they found out that their child or children or family member were using drugs? What advice would you give to them for an immediate thing?
I'd say to do everything the parent could do in his in his or her power to close that generation gap. Get to know your children better. Listen to what they're saying. You know, as parents, a lot of times when our kids talk to us, we don't hear them. We're so busy in our workaday world or our routine that we just don't take the time to listen to what our children are trying to say to us. And many times a kid is trying to tell his parent that he's gotten hung up on drugs. Get to know your kids better. Close that generation gap. Learn to identify with your children, their activities, and by all means, know who their associates are.